Hey guys, alright, today gonna be watching some more Historia Civilis, this time Roman battle tactics. Now, Roman battle tactics, obviously, they pretty much guaranteed their success. The Romans were an exceptionally adaptable people, or well, their military would become, their Romans, they would realize really quickly, early on in their rise to power in the Italian peninsula, that, hey, if we adapt our armies, we do better. They realized this pretty quick. They obviously stole some of their ideas from the Greeks. Early Roman formation looked very similar to Greek phalanxes. Over time, it would adapt so that it could be a more flexible formation, so that they could maneuver better in battle. Another aspect of it is that it was designed so that it would minimize the amount of people that would retreat, because obviously if you're going to be, the newest recruits are going to be the ones that are at the front lines of Roman battle formations, while the veterans are in the back. You aren't gonna fucking run away if a veteran is standing right behind you. I can guarantee you that. That you're not gonna want to do that. But what this also does is that they would rotate now and then during long battles, where the front line would move back in the formation, and then those behind them would become the new front line, so that those that were previously fighting up front can get some rest, so that they're always fresh. And this gave them immense advantage over their enemies, because let's say you're trying to get through this one guy's shield or something, and then they change right in front of you. They do their rotation, and now you got a new guy coming at you. You're fucked. Anyways, let's go ahead and hear Roman battle tactics from Historia Civilis.
Studying the Roman fighting style is no simple thing.
Yo, this is an
It
old
spans
video.
over 1,000 years, to say nothing of the Byzantines. In the West, if you look at Rome's basic tactical framework in a general way, it can be divided into 3 distinct systems. These systems have remarkably little to do with each other, and were constructed to accomplish 3 very different goals. It's actually astounding that they all belong to the same culture. Today, I want to talk about all 3 of these in turn. Let's get started. The phalanx system is the first one that Rome adopted. It came directly from Greece, as a result of early Greek influence on the Italian peninsula. A phalanx was a unit of tightly grouped armored spearmen, who moved and fought as one. There's a reason why the Greek fighting style was being appropriated by these foreigners. Phalanxes were tough, damned near invincible, actually. They were slow, but once they came into contact with the enemy, the combined weight of the entire unit was too much for anybody to handle, unless it was met with another phalanx. So the early Romans straight up stole this fighting technique. They used it with a lot of success against some of their neighbors who fought in a much less organized way. The standard way to array phalanxes was in one giant straight line. Any enemy charging into this would have been met with one giant wall of spears. The early battles would have been pretty lopsided, as the Romans just plowed over these undisciplined guys in loose formations. The only bad thing about phalanxes is that they were very slow and had a hard time turning. Also, because of the way that everybody had to support the spearmen at the front, they couldn't fight in more than one direction at once. The more traditional way to counteract this was to put a lot of cavalry on the wings, to protect against any flanking attacks. They could also chase down any faster enemies that the phalanx couldn't catch. For whatever reason, the Romans never really did much of this, but they were successful all the same. This worked.
Yeah, so Romans would not really have their own dedicated cavalry. Like, there wouldn't, obviously there would be some Roman cavalry. However, that isn't really what they did. They didn't focus on it. They would use their allies or their vassal states, and they would use them for their cavalry inside of their armies. A lot of Roman legions, well, I shouldn't say Roman legions, because Roman legions were made up of Romans, but Roman armies, there would be certain segments of that army, large portions of the army would be made up of Roman allies or vassals.
Worked for a long time, but it started to get the Romans into trouble as they
like Spaniards or Gauls, that kind of thing. Local Italian, smaller Italian peoples,
expanded into central Italy.
Greeks.
This area was mountainous, which is not ideal for the slow-moving straight lines of the phalanx. It's hard to keep a line like this perfectly straight as you move up a hill, for example. If you have to move around some rocky, impassable terrain, the entire line has to be broken up, which is the perfect time for an enemy to attack. Moreover, the inhabitants of this region were no slouches. They used hit-and-run tactics, and lots of projectile weapons. Even when they closed in for hand-to-hand fighting, these were tough mountain men, and they gave the Romans a run for their money. The Romans suffered a string of defeats and began to seriously reevaluate how they fought. Maniples were an ingenious solution to this very specific problem with the phalanx: inflexibility. First of all, maniples were smaller, standalone units. This meant that they were capable of fighting in isolation, or even in several directions at once. A phalanx would usually crumble if it ever got surrounded, whereas a maniple could shift and adapt. Second, they could move much more fluidly. Instead of arraying themselves in big solid lines like the phalanx did, maniples arrayed themselves like this, in a checkerboard pattern. This was a fundamental change. Now they didn't have to step out of formation if they ever wanted to go over hilly terrain, or dodge trees and rocks, or cross a stream. The entire formation can kind of flex and bend as necessary, while maintaining its readiness. It wasn't just—
Which, by the way, if you have any understanding of... This is one of those... You guys made fun of me in that history's worst non-water floods reaction. You guys roasted me for my lack of understanding of scientific physics, like the number stuff with physics. But I understand some things, and this kind of thing, if you understand it, it's you want a structure that bends. You don't want a structure that's completely rigid, because then if it meets a strong enough force, it's going to completely break. But if you have a structure that bends and moves, then it'll move with the opposing force and have less likely or less of a chance to completely crumble. It may still get damaged, of course, but it has more opportunity to stay, for the most part, all together. You can see this with stoplights. If you pay attention on a windy day to stoplights, those things move a lot because that's what they're designed to do. If they were completely rigid in that wind, they'd just snap off at a strong enough wind. And in terms of battle, it's good to be flexible. It's good to bend against the enemy, because it just, for pretty much like the same reasons. If you can bend, it gives one a sense of comfort because you're like able to retreat a little bit. If you're able to step back a little bit, there's a little bit of comfort in being able to have maneuverability. But if you're a completely static phalanx formation and you can't really move, you're scared as fuck. At least I would be in a phalanx formation if I'm getting surrounded, because then I can't move. I can't answer that attack, right? I think I explained that decently. Just a weird tangent.
Just the formations that changed. Their entire fighting ethos was now different. The solid walls of spearmen were now mostly gone, replaced by men wielding swords and shields. Individual maniples now found themselves in specialized roles. There were three major ones. First, the histati. This is where the young and inexperienced men served. The histati were always placed at the front of the line, and
I
were
talked
the
about that
first
at the
to come
beginning.
into contact with the enemy. Histati were outfitted with a sword and shield, but also with javelins that the entire unit could throw at a moment's notice. This was a big innovation. The phalanx system had no ranged units, which meant that faster enemy units could stay at a distance if they wanted to. Now, not only were maniples faster, but almost every Roman unit was now a ranged unit. The histati were always the first to close and make contact with the enemy. Then, after some time, an order would be given, and the histati would swap out with the second line, who were called the principae. These were older veterans, who were outfitted similarly to the Histati, but with slightly better equipment.
Slightly better equipment because in the early days of this, felt like I was going to sneeze. The early days of this tactic, it was before really the Romans started to provide state-sponsored equipment, because this was back when Roman legions typically were still more loyal to their general than they were to the state. And one of these reasons is because the general was the one who secured their payments, who paid the soldiers. With those payments, the soldiers would pay for better equipment. So it'd be the veterans, like the Principes. I think that's the proper pronunciation, the C as a K. But I also bounce back and forth between Principe and Principe. Because I don't really know. I'm not a linguist. I don't study Latin. Even though I should. But yeah, they would be better outfitted with better armor because they had received the pay for longer. So yeah, I don't really know what else to add on to that except for that's what happened. Principes had the better armor because they had been veterans and they'd been receiving pay for much longer than the Histati. Yeah.
Under normal circumstances, these two lines would alternate for the duration of the battle, giving each other a break as needed. In a perfect world, the third line would never be used. These were the Triarii, and they were the oldest veterans. We can think of them as their elite troops. Unlike the Histati and the Principe, the Triarii retained some phalanx-like qualities. They were still spearmen, but were organized more loosely, so that the entire unit wouldn't crumble if they ever broke formation. The Triarii were so rarely used that the Romans had a saying for when something was going badly. They would say, "It's come to the Triarii." I've always liked this saying, because it has a meaning that's kind of unique to Roman culture. It means that the enemy has broken through and this is the last thing that we can do to respond. But it also means there's a major problem and it's time for the real adults to step in and fix this. It's weirdly pragmatic and optimistic.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, that last statement there. It's an interesting way to look at it. I mean, obviously, sayings and reality are different. The Romans obviously were not a society that generally had young people at the forefront of their politics. They were very much like also how modern politics is, where young people still don't really get the opportunity to be at the forefront because it's the old wealthy people that maintain control. But it's an interesting way to think of it. It's like kind of the ideal, I guess, way to look at how society maybe should be. This is just you can disagree. This is just my thoughts. This is just my opinions on this, going off of this statement here to go on a tangent. Young people starting off at the forefront. They're the generation. They are the future of society, the young people. So they should have the forefront in society, just like the Histati have the forefront on the battlefield. They should be the ones leading the politics, leading the change, right? But they're inexperienced. So if they make some blunders and they need to be swapped out a little bit, all right, let's pull back. Let's bring out the Principes. Let's bring out the slightly older people and see if they can bring things back under control. And then we'll bring back the Histati. Once they're rested, once they've recovered, once they've learned a little bit more. But then if the Principes fail, you fall back onto the old generation, the Triarii, to get things back under control. I think I explained that okay. It makes more sense in my head probably than it did with my words. So yeah, we're just gonna shut up and watch the video.
Campaigning season would go by, and the Triarii would only be used once or twice. This made them crazy. We're told that sometimes they were forced to sit on the ground during battle, like children, because they had this reputation for charging in against orders. They sometimes resorted to begging just to be allowed to get into the fight. I looked and couldn't remember where I saw this, but years ago I read something saying that a Roman general put his Triarii up front during a battle because he was getting reports that there might be a mutiny if they had to sit this one out. That might be apocryphal, but I swear I saw it somewhere. These were tough dudes, and when they were finally unleashed, they fought like hell. Let's go back for a moment to the Battle of the Trebia River. If you recall, the first 2 Roman lines fully committed, and some in the center were in the process of cutting through the enemy and marching right off the battlefield. These were the Hastati and the Principae. The third line, the Triarii, were held back as usual. When Hannibal's epic surprise attack emerged from the long grass, the Triarii turned, fixed spears, and stopped the attack dead in its tracks. They did their job perfectly and didn't give an inch. It was the younger men up front who panicked and started to give in to the Carthaginians on the wings. These same Triarii were the ones who were last seen getting surrounded, holding their ground and making a heroic last stand as the rest of the Romans were killed, captured, or driven off. I'll say it again, these were tough dudes. Rome used this maniple system for a long time, and Rome eventually rose from being a regional to a global power. But as this was happening, they started to notice some structural issues. The maniple was designed to face off against the hill people in central Italy, and now Romans were fighting from Spain to Asia. A lot of the time, they were now in the position of fighting huge, well-organized armies from rich and powerful kingdoms. Things had changed, and Rome needed to reorganize. The solution that they came up with is called the cohort system. Before any major changes were made, one thing was abundantly clear. Rome needed bigger units. The maniples were just too damn small now. Against the hill people of central Italy, one maniple here and one maniple there could make all the difference in the world. But now, armies were huge, and a single maniple here or there was kind of irrelevant. As the first thing going into this reform, the size of each unit was quadrupled. Armies went from having 40 maniples to having 10 cohorts. But a cohort wasn't just a giant maniple.
I don't think those words
They
are too
also
important.
fundamentally changed how these
Zoomed
units
off
operated.
to the upper
The different
left.
experience levels and different specializations were completely done away with, and each cohort became more or less identical. The big strategic change that this facilitated was that the army now emphasized mobility. Unlike the maniple system, these soldiers carried around their own gear, set up their own camps, and cooked their own meals. These guys could construct bridges, clear forests, build roads, anything.
Yeah, so I don't know if it was Historia Civilis that has said it in a different episode video of his, because I have watched him before. I've not watched this video before, but I've watched some of his videos before. I can't remember if it was him or another YouTuber that has said this, but Romans were not just soldiers. They were Roman infantry cohorts weren't just soldiers. The legionaries were not just soldiers. They were also engineers. They built their roads, of course, as he said. They built their bridges to battle. And that's honestly freaking amazing that they were that, skilled. I mean, obviously you'd have the leaders of, like, the generals, the commanders, whatever, that would most likely be the ones designing, or you'd have specific engineers coordinating these soldiers to build the roads and whatnot. But they still had the skill and capabilities to build the roads, which is pretty amazing.
These new units were designed to be...
Which also, these roads still being around to this day in relatively pretty fucking good condition too, which is even more astounding.
Entirely self-sufficient. They needed to be able to ditch their supplies and march off at a moment's notice if they needed to, and they often did. You can see the appeal of this kind of army. When you have guys stationed thousands of kilometers from the capital, in sometimes hostile territory, you don't necessarily want a bunch of specialists. In other words, you don't want to risk having the backbone of your army wiped out during a battle, when reinforcements are months away. You want the entire army to be your backbone, if that makes any sense.
Yep.
There were new tactical realities that emerged naturally from this new organizational structure. With these larger cohorts, it was kind of like each army was made up of 10 smaller armies. This meant that the Romans could now do things differently on the battlefield. They could now delegate a lot more authority to sub-commanders, who could use their own initiative. Under this new system, a general could say, take this cohort and hold the line over there and use your own judgment. It's important to...
Kind of what we see Napoleon use in his wars against the coalitions, with his tactics of what were they called? I forget what he called them. His sub armies. He had a different name for them, but I forgot. Where his marshals would be the leaders of these smaller armies, but he was still the grand commander. But what it allowed him to do was it allowed him far grander speed. It allowed him to move his armies way faster, and it also allowed for greater maneuverability of his armies, more flexibility in surrounding the enemy and flanking and whatnot. Allowed them to cover way more ground. This is he obviously based that tactic that he made off of this Roman tactic here, but obviously the Roman tactic here is much on a more smaller scale, on the battlefield scale, while Napoleon's tactic was on the more wider, grander country level scale for maneuvering armies.
To emphasize that almost every cohort was identical, which was a radical change. It meant that any individual unit could step in for another one without any disruption. It also meant that if you wanted to supersize an army, all you had to do was add a few extra cohorts. There was never a situation where you'd be thinking, I have way too many Hastati and not enough Triarii. There was no such thing as a lopsided army. Every unit was the same and self-contained. So what did it mean that they used all of these different tactical structures? It's not like one was a natural consequence of the previous one. These were all radically different systems.
I would argue that the maniple is kind of the cohort is a reasonable evolution from the maniple. It's kind of the same thing. It's just more mass generalizing, I guess, the army, more uniform, making the army more uniform and similar or whatever. Uniform. That's the word I'm going to use. There's just that. Because I can't think of other words at the moment. But I would definitely say the maniple from the phalanx is a bit of a more drastic jump than cohort from maniple, though. That one I can definitely see. But, still, the Romans are answering a certain adversary they have to face, and the response to that opponent is for them to make a more flexible army. And so going from phalanx to maniple does make sense. It's a reasonable progression, in my
Romans
opinion.
were successful with all of them, but each accomplished very different things, so what gives? Above all, the Romans were pragmatic. When a thing stopped working, they ditched it, unsentimentally. They adopted the phalanx system to solve a very specific problem, which was that they had some powerful neighbors that already used the phalanx, which was at the time considered unstoppable. They adopted the maniple system to solve another very specific problem, which was that they needed to fight on uneven terrain and respond to hit and run attacks from creative, less organized enemies. The cohort system was adopted to solve yet another very specific problem, which was that they were now fighting larger, more traditional armies in remote, far-flung provinces. All of a sudden, Rome needed a large-scale, professional, standardized army, so they invented
Standardized. That was the word I was trying to think of.
Tactical innovation allowed Rome to flourish for over 1,000 years in the West. That's no small thing. This constant change also meant that, for them, failure was an option. Each time they were defeated in a major battle, they made significant changes to their military.
They did, yeah.
And usually for the better.
You can see that really kind of especially with, Marian reforms probably being the most famous. Another famous example of this is the Punic Wars, in which Rome was losing handedly too. Rome would steal, I think, Carthaginian naval designs and put them into their own navy so that they could fight the Carthaginians at sea a bit. When Hannibal was wrecking the peninsula, they adapted, right? They tried to adapt. They made changes to their military and their tactics. They were very adaptable
cultural trait
people.
That's hard to teach, but it was probably Rome's greatest strength.
That's the video. I love Historia Civilis, and I know you guys do too, because you do recommend him a lot. You always. This is one of those channels you guys really like me to watch. Up there with Epic History TV, I'd say. This is definitely probably behind Epic History TV. Probably one of the names I see the most. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Leave a suggestion down below for what you want to see me react to next, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you.